Hey, it's A Humble Collector here. In today's video, we're taking a look at a bit of a different item than we normally see. This is a printing plate that is showing Airship R31. And admittedly, when I bought the printing plate, it was just like, oh, that's a neat dirigible. It's military related. There's a car driving by, but I was like, yeah, it's kind of neat. So I bought it. It wasn't very expensive. And it wasn't until I was getting ready to do this video that I started researching R31 that I found out it actually had a really unique and honestly kind of crazy story behind it. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So Airship R31 was the first and only one of two of a class of rigid airships developed by the British in the latter half of World War I. Now, one of the things that made R31 unique was that instead of being made out of duraluminum, like the German and other British airships were at the time, she was actually constructed with a rigid frame made of plywood. And that's kind of strange to me because the British have this weird thing with making aircraft out of plywood. They did the same thing in World War II with the Mosquito. So not really sure what the correlation is between the two there, besides the fact that wood's just a really cheap material. But moving on from that, the design itself is actually very similar to those used by the Luftschiffbau Schutte-Lanz company. Now, Schutte-Lanz made a lot of the German airships for World War I, and at the time and after the war, a lot of people thought that the R-31 was actually reverse engineered from the SL-11, which was the first German airship that was actually shot down over England. However, SL-11 was so badly burnt out, there really wasn't anything they could learn from the remains. So the reason that R-31 actually shares so much with the SL airships is because of a man by the name of Muller. Now, Muller, we only know as Muller. There's no other record I could find of like a first name. And he apparently approached the British and told them that he was a previous foreman from the Luftschiffbau Schutte-Lanz company, and wanted to sell his knowledge and experience to them. So he'd gone to Switzerland. The Swiss kind of acted as like an intermediary. And the British, interviewed him, and he actually had like drawings and things, was able to prove that he actually knew a lot about airships. And in addition to that, he also brought a sample of a recently developed glue that the Germans had made known as Kaltine, or cold glue. So because of this, the early designs for the airship were actually known as SLM, or Schutte-Lanz Muller. And we're going to get into a little bit more about Muller later on because I find him a bit of an interesting figure. Now, once the decision was made to actually build this airship, it was contracted out to the Short Brothers Company of Bedford, and work would begin on the airship in late 1916. Now, the R-31 was actually a pretty big ship, measured in at 615 feet or 187 meters long, had a diameter of 66 feet or 20 meters, and had a gas capacity of over 1.5 million cubic feet, or close to 44,000 cubic meters. Now, as previously mentioned, the rigid frame of the airship was being made out of wood, in this case spruce plywood, which was treated to be fireproof and then varnished, and the plywood was held together, I believe, with that Kaltine that Muller had actually brought with him. Now, the wood was arranged into triangular patterns, which were then reinforced with steel gussets, and then the entire airship was actually braced with nearly 100 miles or 161 kilometers of piano wire. So this large wooden frame apparently very much resembled like a birdcage when it was being constructed. Now, holding R-31 aloft would be 21 gas bags, which were made out of a cotton fiber and separated from each other by rubber. And when the ship was first being built, it was equipped with 6 275 horsepower Rolls-Royce Eagle engines. And during R-31's first test flight, this allowed it to achieve a maximum speed of 70 miles per hour, which is roughly 113 kilometers per hour, which is a pretty darn fast for an airship. Now, this first flight occurred in August of 1918, and R-31 at the time was under the command of Squadron Commander W.C. Hicks. A second test flight would follow in October of 1918, which had to be cut short as the top vertical fin of R-31 collapsed, which the crew was not particularly pleased with. So they had to do an emergency landing, return to base. When they landed, the two horizontal fins collapsed as well. So they realized there were some structural issues. They did some rework, fixed it. Everything seemed to be fine. And R-31's final test flight would take place on November 6th, 1918, 5 days before the end of the war. And this was supposed to just be a routine flight. They were supposed to fly from the East Fortune Airship Base, or they were supposed to fly to the East Fortune Airship Base near Edinburgh. And at some point during the flight, it was reported that some of the girders began to fail. It's kind of vague exactly how they were failing, if like the glue was starting to split apart or if the structure itself started to lose rigidity. But because of this, the crew made an emergency landing at Howden in Yorkshire. So at this point, the war is basically over. The crew basically parks R-31 in a hangar that had been previously damaged by fire, which is going to be important later, and left. The war ended 5 days later, and apparently in the confusion of the following months, nobody really questioned where R31 actually was, to the point that in early 1919, they actually had to do an inquiry to figure out where the airship was. Once they finally found it, they were quite unhappy to find that the airship had been left in this fire-damaged hangar over the winter, and there were multiple holes in the roof. So R31 sat outside, basically, in the wet English winter and proceeded to get horribly rotten, and the wood glue that was holding the plywood together actually started to loosen as a result of being inundated with moisture. So the airship was just a complete loss at this point and had to be decommissioned. So at this point, R31 is scrapped, and that scrap is purchased by a local coal merchant for the price of about 200 pounds. Now, this coal merchant's plan is to sell the literal tons of wood that are left from R31's frame as firewood. Now, if you'll remember a few minutes ago, we were discussing the fact that R31's wood was fireproofed prior to construction, which means that none of the wood burned. So you can imagine the coal merchant started to get some very angry correspondence from the people buying from him. And at this point, the fate of the rest of R31 is kind of unknown. I would assume that at that point, the coal merchant probably just let it rot wherever it was being stored. But I can't find any record of exactly what happened. But it sounds like he was out 200 pounds, which I think is kind of funny. And it's really kind of a shame because given R31's speed and the armament it was supposed to be equipped with, which was a 12-pounder autocannon, a couple machine guns for personal defense, and a small allotment of 520 and 230-pound bombs, that she would have been very effective in a role as a sub-hunter. You know, as an anti-submarine airship, her job would be flying above, British trade or British naval ships and, spotting for enemy submarines. If it finds one, swooping down, taking it out. It seems like she would have been effective in that role, and it's really a shame that she didn't get to serve in that capacity. In fact, didn't really see military service at all. She had less than, I believe, 10 hours of flight time, between her couple of test flights. So yeah, that's kind of the sad fate of R31. It just kind of rotted and shed and then failed at being firewood. Now, that could be where I end this video, but I want to talk a little bit more about Muller. Because in all of the sources I could find on R31, Muller is kind of referred to as this man of mystery. And what's interesting is after the British canceled their airship program in, I believe, 1921, Muller shows up in Washington, D.C., apparently trying to cut the same deal they did with the British with the Americans. Hey, I used to work at this famous German airship company. I have all this know-how, and I can help you out. And apparently at that point, D.C. was not biting, and Muller kind of slips off into the sands of time, as it were, and nothing's ever really heard of him again. Unfortunately, having the last name of Muller is quite common, so I tried doing a little bit of digging, but I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find any employee records from the airship company or anything like that. So while I'm sure the British government probably have a file detailing who Muller is with probably a little bit more of biographical information, as far as I can tell, that's not public, or it's probably even lost by now. But yes, this is the story of R31 and the mysterious man who helped in her construction. And yeah, given the fact that all came from researching this print plate that I had in my collection, I thought that was made for a pretty interesting video overall. And that's kind of one of the fun things with collecting militaria, if you collect more than just one specific thing, is you find weird little items every now and then, and they don't seem very interesting, and then you start doing research, you find out there's this whole crazy story behind them. That's one of the reasons I like my death cards, for example. But yeah, overall, I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment down below. Love hearing from you. Thank you all for watching. Happy collecting, and I'll see you all again very soon.